trying to get attention. Even if I'm not Maddie, I could be another girl maybe, but I believe that I'm
There will be people who will not believe me, who will hate me, but I didn't expect that I will get death threats.
24-year-old Polish national Julia Wandelt, who allegedly said she was the missing toddler, grown up of course, is accused of stalking the family by sending them letters, messages on their phones and turning up at their home, all of which she denies. Madeleine McCann disappeared at the age of 3 in 2007 after her parents tucked her up in bed while on holiday in Delusion.
Well, Julia Wandelt is a 23-year-old Polish woman who claimed in an Instagram post in 2023 to be the missing Madeleine McCann. But she has been arrested last night at Bristol Airport by officers from Leicestershire Police.
On October 6, 2025, Leicester Crown Court opened its doors to one of the most surreal trials of the decade. Julia Wandelt, a young woman from Poland, and Karen Sprague, her co-conspirator, faced charges of stalking and harassment against the McCann family. For years, Julia claimed she was Madeleine McCann, altering images with AI, sending dozens of messages, and even confronting the family at their doorstep. Her obsession escalated from online fantasy to real-world intrusion, blurring the line between delusion and crime. This case exposes the power of social media, identity obsession, and the collateral damage of unchecked attention. On October 6, 2025, the Leicester Crown Court opened the long-awaited trial of Julia Wandelt, a 24-year-old woman from Poland, and Karen Sprague, a 61-year-old from Cardiff. The courtroom was filled with anticipation, as this was the first trial in the UK focused on the issue of impersonating the missing child, Madeleine McCann. The case had garnered significant attention both in the UK and internationally, partly due to the intense media scrutiny surrounding the McCann case and the viral nature of Wandelt's claims. The trial was poised to shed light on the disturbing consequences of social media-driven misinformation and obsession, while also addressing the serious implications of stalking and harassment. The prosecution opened with a powerful statement by Michael Duck KC, who addressed the jury with clarity and authority. "Let's make it clear Julia Wandelt is not Madeleine McCann." This unequivocal declaration set the tone for what would be an emotionally charged courtroom drama. As Duck's words echoed through the room, Julia Wandelt, seated in the dock, was visibly shaken. She stood up, tears streaming down her face, her distress palpable. The courtroom fell silent as she tried to process the statement that cast her entire identity in question. In an act of solidarity, Karen Sprague, her co-defendant, reached out and embraced Wandelt, offering comfort as the young woman struggled to compose herself. It was a poignant moment, highlighting the emotional stakes at play in this case, not just for the McCann family, who had suffered unimaginable loss, but for Wandelt as well, who had become entwined in a complex web of delusion, obsession, and social media-driven fame. The trial was presided over by Mrs. Justice Cutts, an experienced judge tasked with ensuring fairness in this high-profile case. The 12-member jury listened attentively as the prosecution laid out the charges against the two women. The allegations were serious stalking and harassment that caused serious alarm and distress to the McCann family. The period of the alleged harassment spanned from June 2022 to February 2025, during which Wandelt repeatedly reached out to the McCanns through various channels, including phone calls, emails, and even attempts to make personal contact at their home in Rothley. The prosecution emphasized the severity of these actions, underlining how such behavior crossed the line from mere obsession into criminal conduct that had deeply impacted the McCann family. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, with the presence of both press and public observers. Journalists from major outlets like the BBC, The Guardian, and local newspapers had gathered to report on the proceedings. The courtroom was filled with a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and unease, as people recognized the significance of this case, not just as a legal matter, but as a cultural moment that exposed the dangers of social media's influence on real-life events. The McCann case had already been one of the most high-profile missing persons cases in modern history, and now it was being brought to the courtroom in a new and unexpected way. This was a trial that straddled the line between criminal justice and the broader conversation about the role of media and the internet in shaping public perceptions and personal identities. The trial's opening remarks set the stage for what would unfold as a deeply emotional and psychologically complex case. The prosecution wasted no time in asserting the core of their argument, that Julia Wandelt was not Madeleine McCann, and that her insistence on being the missing child was not only a false claim, but one that had caused significant harm to the McCann family. The media had already shaped much of the public's perception of the case, with some individuals supporting Wandelt's claims, while others criticized her for what they saw as an exploitation of the McCanns' tragedy. The trial was set to address these layers of confusion, as well as the social media-driven culture that had enabled Wandelt's story to go viral. What made this case particularly unique was the role of social media in driving Wandelt's behavior. The prosecutor made it clear that this was the first trial in the UK to deal with the consequences of impersonating a missing child in such a public and aggressive manner. The internet had given Julia Wandelt a platform to make her false claims to millions of people, drawing in supporters who believed her story or simply fed off the drama of the situation. In doing so, social media had acted as both a catalyst and an amplifier for her increasingly erratic behavior. Wandelt had used the digital landscape to create an alternative narrative about her identity, one that was based on her perceived resemblance to Madeleine McCann, and then used that narrative to manipulate the McCann family. This was not merely a case about a single person's delusion. It was a case that reflected the darker side of the digital age, where false identities can be constructed, spread, and believed by large audiences, often with dangerous consequences. The court proceedings were not just about addressing Julia Wandelt's actions, they were also about examining the impact of digital fame, online communities, and the ways in which social media can warp reality and exacerbate personal crises. As the trial unfolded, it became clear that this case was more than just a legal matter. It was a reflection of the profound impact that the internet can have on people's lives, particularly when it intersects with real-world trauma and loss. The McCann family had already endured years of media speculation, false theories, and invasive attention. Now, they found themselves at the center of yet another media-driven spectacle, this time involving a woman who believed herself to be the daughter they lost nearly 2 decades ago. The opening day of the trial set the stage for what would be an intense examination of not just the facts of the case, but the larger societal issues surrounding identity, fame, and the power of the internet. As the prosecution continued to present its case, it was clear that the McCann family would not only have to endure the trauma of being targeted by a stalker, but also the painful realization that their daughter's name had been co-opted by someone seeking attention, validation, and perhaps a sense of belonging. As the day drew to a close, the room was filled with a sense of both resolution and uncertainty. The case against Julia Wandelt and Karen Sprague was just beginning, and the questions it raised about the nature of identity, the dangers of social media, and the limits of obsession were far from answered. But one thing was certain: this trial would be a landmark moment in the ongoing conversation about how we navigate the complex intersection of reality and the digital world. In 2022, Julia Wandelt began an online journey that would captivate the public's imagination and spark controversy worldwide. She claimed, with increasing certainty, that she was the missing child, Madeleine McCann, whose disappearance in 2007 had left the world in shock. Julia's behavior escalated from sporadic social media posts to full-blown attempts to prove her identity through various means, including photo comparisons, artificial intelligence, AI manipulation, and deepfake technology. But what led Julia to make such an audacious claim? And how did the internet help propagate her story? This process of self-identification and public validation raised serious psychological and ethical questions, including the role of mental health, social media influence, and the ethics of internet fame. It all began in 2022 when Julia, a 24-year-old woman from Poland, started posting pictures of herself on social, comparing her facial features to those of Madeleine McCann. She highlighted similarities in her nose, eyes, and even a birthmark near her iris that she claimed resembled the one Madeleine had. These photos were presented to the public as evidence that Julia might be the missing child, and they quickly went viral. The more people engaged with her content, the more Julia's belief in her own identity as Madeleine solidified. She posted side-by-side images of herself and Madeleine, encouraging viewers to make their own comparisons. The emotional power of this claim, coupled with the public's obsession with the McCann case, allowed Julia to attract thousands of followers. However, this was only the beginning of her attempt to morph into the persona she had chosen. Julia's use of image manipulation tools, AI, and filters took the comparison to a new level. She began to edit her photos to create even more striking resemblances to Madeleine. AI-generated filters smoothed her features, enhanced her facial structure, and subtly adjusted her eye color to mimic Madeleine's exact iris pattern. Using tools like deepfake technology to alter her appearance, Julia was not only seeking to prove a visual similarity, but also to strengthen her narrative that she had the same facial features and the same unique iris pattern that Madeleine had. This was a crucial step in her strategy to convince herself and others that she was the missing child, employing technology to validate her delusion. The lines between reality and fabrication became blurred, as the images she posted no longer represented truth, but rather a constructed digital identity. As the case progressed, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence that Julia had manipulated her images to support her claims. One of the key pieces of evidence was the altered photos she had posted online. Experts showed how Julia had used deep learning algorithms and AI filters to adjust her eye color, smooth out facial features, and modify other facial traits, presenting an artificially enhanced version of herself. This was not just about visual resemblance, it was about creating a digital proof that Julia and Madeleine were the same person. The deepfake iris pattern, the precise adjustment to match Madeleine's distinctive eye marking, was one of the most striking elements of this deception. AI tools had allowed Julia to create a fake version of reality, a digital simulation that could fool the casual observer. The prosecution also highlighted how these doctored images were used to mislead and manipulate the public into believing Julia's claim. The modified photos were widely shared across social media, and Julia's online following ballooned. Supporters, some of whom believed she was indeed Madeleine, rallied behind her, and even demanded that the McCanns agree to a DNA test. Julia herself persisted in this belief, and as her virtual identity gained traction, she was convinced that the altered images and AI-enhanced photos were irrefutable evidence of her identity. However, Julia's case didn't stop with just one claim. As the prosecution investigated her behavior, it was revealed that Julia had previously contacted 3 different missing person organizations, claiming to be 3 different missing girls, before she settled on Madeleine McCann. Initially, Julia claimed she might be Inga Jark, a missing German child, and later moved on to Asia Bishop, a U.S. missing person case. But Madeleine McCann was the one who brought her the viral attention and social media validation. Julia's continual shifting of identities raised alarming psychological questions. Why did she feel the need to claim so many different missing children? What drove her to latch on to these identities? And why did she settle on Madeleine? This behavior can be attributed to a disorder of identity or a delusional disorder, where the individual creates alternate identities in a bid to escape their own reality. Psychological analysis suggests that Julia may have been seeking visibility, the same visibility complex that many individuals with similar delusions experience. By claiming to be a famous missing person, Julia ensured that she would be seen and recognized in a way that her everyday life may not have provided. Her online persona as Madeleine McCann became her mask, and the world she inhabited through the lens of social media allowed her to become visible in a way that fulfilled her psychological needs. Julia's story didn't remain confined to the internet. She appeared on Dr. Phil, a talk show where many people with controversial claims are given a platform to share their stories. This appearance was facilitated by Fia Johansson, a self-proclaimed psychic and public figure who took Julia under her wing. Johansson played a significant role in amplifying Julia's claims by promoting the idea that Julia was indeed Madeleine McCann. Fia, whose background includes consulting for missing persons cases and even making predictions about missing children, used her social media and public platform to boost Julia's narrative. In some ways, Fia Johansson played a role in the commercialization of Julia's delusion, turning a deeply personal and distressing issue into a public spectacle. Johansson herself was portrayed as a spiritual guide who sought to validate Julia's belief despite the lack of any real evidence. The Dr. Phil show capitalized on the drama, treating it as a sensational story that could draw in viewers. This blending of mental health issues and entertainment created a toxic environment in which Julia's claims were no longer seen as delusional, but as an issue for public debate. By giving Julia a platform on such a high-profile show, the media not only perpetuated the myth of her identity, but also made her story entertainment. The public, in turn, became desensitized to the emotional and psychological damage caused by Julia's actions as they watched her go from one identity to the next. Dr. Phil, despite attempting to address the psychological aspects of Julia's story, inadvertently commercialized her delusion, turning it into a narrative for consumption rather than a case to be taken seriously. Julia Wandelt's case is a tragic illustration of how mental health issues, particularly identity disorders and delusions, can be exacerbated by social media and internet culture. Her journey from claiming to be one missing person to claiming to be another points to a crisis of identity and inability to reconcile who she was with, how she wished to be seen by others. This desire for visibility often leads to delusions of grandeur, where the individual believes they are someone significant, someone who deserves attention and recognition, regardless of the truth. The role of social media cannot be overstated in this case. Social platforms allowed Julia to gather a following that validated her claims, despite the fact that they were completely unfounded. The visibility complex became a self-perpetuating loop. Julia sought attention by claiming to be Madeleine McCann, and the more attention she received, the more convinced she became of her identity as the missing child. The psychological impact of this constant feedback loop was profound, as it distorted her perception of reality and drove her to take extreme actions, such as contacting missing persons organizations and harassing the McCann family. Julia Wandelt's story is a cautionary tale about the intersection of mental health, social media, and public entertainment. Her delusion of being Madeleine McCann became not only a personal tragedy, but also a public spectacle. The media, along with figures like Fia Johansson, played an instrumental role in turning her delusion into entertainment, further blurring the lines between reality and fantasy. As the case moves forward, it will be important to consider the role of both media responsibility and psychological care in dealing with individuals who seek attention through extreme and damaging means. Julia's story is not just one of imposter syndrome gone viral, but also a reflection of how internet culture can sometimes encourage and amplify dangerous delusions. Ultimately, her journey raises profound questions about how we, as a society, handle identity, fame, and the psychological toll that the pursuit of both can have on an individual's sense of self. In the summer of 2022, Julia Wandelt began her campaign of persistent contact with the McCann family. This started innocuously enough with social media posts and online claims, but quickly escalated into an obsessive and unsettling pattern of harassment. Wandelt, convinced she was Madeleine McCann, began reaching out to the McCann family, most notably Jerry McCann, Kate McCann, and their daughter Amelie through various channels, including email, phone calls, and even voicemails. Her increasingly desperate attempts to convince them of her identity formed a complex and disturbing psychological case, showcasing the dangers of internet-driven delusions and the severe impact of rejection and obsessive behaviors. It all began with an email to Jerry McCann, Madeleine's father. Julia's message read, "I could be your daughter." This email set the stage for what would become a relentless pursuit of attention and validation from a family that had already suffered immeasurable loss. In this message, Julia was not merely expressing a fleeting thought. She was laying the groundwork for a story that she had begun to tell herself and the public. In her mind, she was not just a woman with an uncanny resemblance to Madeleine McCann, she was Madeleine McCann, and her actions from that point on would reflect this belief. This email marked the beginning of Julia's obsession with Jerry McCann, her need to force a connection with the McCanns, despite their clear rejection. Julia didn't stop with emails to Jerry. Emily McCann, Madeleine's younger sister, also became a target of Julia's relentless communications. She sent messages to Emily, writing, "I'm the girl who went viral saying I'm Madeleine." This statement highlighted the escalation of Julia's behavior as she began to openly acknowledge her growing public attention. The phrase, "went viral," revealed the extent to which social media had shaped her reality. Julia saw the viral nature of her claim as validation, and she continued to push harder, believing that being recognized as Madeleine was not just an online identity, but a potential truth. In this message, Julia's recognition of her viral fame is telling it wasn't just the family she sought validation from, it was the public, the social media communities, and the crowds that she had amassed around her delusion. Her reliance on internet validation exposed the visibility complex, the need to be seen and acknowledged by a large audience. Even if that meant crossing ethical and personal boundaries, the messages to Kate McCann, Madeleine's mother, were among the most troubling. Julia, increasingly desperate, attempted to play on Kate's emotions, writing, "I know you're afraid of Jerry, but please call me." This message was not only an attempt at emotional manipulation, but also a veiled accusation aimed at creating division within the McCann family. By saying, "I know you're afraid of Jerry," Julia was trying to insert herself into the family dynamic, positioning herself as someone who understood or could empathize with the emotional turmoil of the McCanns. Julia's tactic here was not merely to present herself as Madeleine, but to offer herself as a comforting figure who could bring closure to a family that had been torn apart by tragedy. This attempt to use sympathy to control or influence Kate's response was a psychological strategy that sought to bypass Kate's natural skepticism. In reality, Julia's need for validation and attention was consuming her. Instead of understanding the boundaries that the McCann family had set, Julia became even more desperate. The refusal of the McCanns to respond to her attempts only fueled her obsession. Julia's attempts reached their peak with a voicemail message she left for Kate McCann. The message lasted 1 minute and 52 seconds, and was one of the most disturbing elements presented in court. Julia's voice on the recording was filled with desperation, and her words were a poignant plea. "Don't give up on your daughter." The message, which was played in court during the trial, laid bare the level of obsession Julia had reached. In the voicemail, she continued to make bold claims about knowing things only you, I, and Jerry would know, further escalating the emotional pressure on Kate. Julia believed that by offering specific memories, she could convince Kate of her identity. The voicemail was not just a desperate plea for attention, it was a manipulative tactic aimed at emotionally coercing the McCanns into acknowledging her. Julia did not stop at a single voicemail. She made 60 phone calls to Kate McCann, each one a further intrusion into a life already ravaged by grief. Every unanswered call deepened her belief that the McCanns were hiding the truth. Her obsession grew exponentially with each rejected attempt to connect. These calls represented unrelenting harassment, and Julia's mindset became more fixated on proving her identity to the McCanns. In Julia's mind, the fact that they were not responding meant that they were, in some way, acknowledging her claim. She didn't interpret their refusal as a clear sign to stop, rather. She used it as fuel for her delusion, believing that the McCanns were afraid to accept her as their daughter. By June 2024, Operation Grange, the police team investigating Madeleine McCann's disappearance, had become involved in the case. Julia was warned by the police that she should cease her attempts to contact the McCann family, as they were legally protected from such harassment. However, Julia's response to the warning was chilling. "I will not give up." This statement encapsulated the depth of Julia's obsession. She was not just chasing a delusion, she was now openly rejecting the reality of the situation. Psychologically, Julia had entered a rejection feedback loop. The more she was rejected, the more determined she became. Rejection, in this case, didn't signal the end of her pursuit. Rather, it reinforced her belief that the McCanns were denying her truth, making her push even harder. Julia's behavior can be understood through the lens of obsessive-compulsive tendencies and delusional disorder. The constant pursuit of the McCanns, despite their clear rejections, showcases the classic traits of a rejection feedback loop. In such loops, individuals who face rejection do not view it as a boundary or a limit. Instead, they interpret it as proof that their beliefs are correct. The more they are rejected, the more they believe their claim is being actively suppressed, thus intensifying their pursuit. In Julia's case, this loop was made worse by the validation she received from the social media communities that followed her. These followers cheered her on, reinforcing her belief that she was on the right path. This created an environment where rejection only fueled her obsessive behavior, making her believe that increasing her efforts would somehow force the McCanns to accept her as their daughter. Julia's behavior was not just harassment, it was the result of a deeply rooted psychological disorder, exacerbated by the internet's ability to amplify delusions. The feedback loop between Julia's attempts and the emotional rejection she faced created a cycle that she could not escape from. Her need for visibility and validation became so consuming that it overshadowed any rational thought, leading her to increasingly disturbing actions. Julia Wandelt's story is a tragic example of how obsession and delusion can be exacerbated by the digital age. Her constant attempts to contact the McCann family, despite their clear refusal, are a powerful reminder of the psychological toll that rejection and delusional beliefs can have on individuals. Julia's case also underscores the dangers of social media, where the need for validation and visibility can lead to extreme behaviors, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. As this case continues to unfold, it serves as a stark warning about the mental health issues that are often overlooked in the online sphere, and the devastating effects they can have on both the individuals involved and the people around them. In November 2024, Julia Wandelt's obsession with the McCann family reached a dangerous and deeply unsettling point. After months of online harassment and countless attempts to contact Jerry and Kate McCann, Julia traveled to the UK. Accompanied by her co-defendant, Karen Sprague, their destination was Rothley, the small village where the McCanns lived, and the very place where Madeleine McCann had been abducted in 2007. Julia's arrival in the UK marked the escalation of her actions from online harassment to direct physical presence, and the consequences would prove far-reaching. The first indication of Julia and Karen's intentions came when CCTV footage from outside the McCanns' home captured their car parked in front of the house, with the lights turned off. This was no accidental visit. It was a deliberate act of stalking. The two women were sitting in their car, waiting for the McCanns to return home. In a message sent by Karen Sprague to a third party, she confirmed their location. "We're sitting outside the McCanns with lights off." This was not just a visit, it was a deliberate act of surveillance, designed to instill fear and discomfort in the McCanns. The tension was mounting. Julia and Karen were not there to seek answers or closure, they were there to force an interaction, to push their narrative onto a family who had suffered unspeakably. Kate McCann returned home alone that evening. Upon seeing the car parked outside her home, her immediate concern must have been the invasion of her privacy yet again, but nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. Julia approached the door, physically blocking Kate from entering her home. The demand was clear: a DNA test. Julia was insistent that she was Madeleine McCann, and she would stop at nothing to prove it. This moment was not just a confrontation, it was the culmination of months of online harassment made real. Julia had now crossed a line, not just by contacting the McCanns repeatedly, but by physically interfering with Kate's ability to feel safe in her own home. Kate McCann, visibly shaken and frightened, was trapped between the door and the two women. She managed to retreat inside, but Julia and Karen were not ready to let her go. They began to bang and kick at the door, demanding that Kate open it and listen to them. The escalation from emails and voicemails to physical confrontation was chilling. For Kate, this was not just a moment of personal violation, It was a re-traumatization of the years of pain and uncertainty she had lived through since Madeleine's disappearance. The constant invasion of her personal space and her inability to escape from the situation must have left her feeling vulnerable, helpless, and powerless. When Jerry McCann arrived home, the situation didn't improve. Julia and Karen attempted to force their letter into Jerry's hands, demanding that he read it, as they believed their DNA test proposal was valid. The tension in the air was thick, with the confrontation becoming increasingly hostile. Jerry was clear in his response, firmly telling them, "I don't want this. Please leave the premises." His words, however, were drowned out by the screaming and shouting from the two women, who refused to take no for an answer. They were not there to accept rejection, they were there to impose their narrative, to break down the walls of privacy and dignity the McCanns had desperately tried to protect. The following day, another disturbing element of Julia's actions was revealed. A bottle of wine and a letter were found outside the McCanns' front door. The letter was signed with the name Madeleine, and the contents were a poignant and haunting display of Julia's distorted emotional attachment to the family. She wrote, "I'm so sorry for causing you so much distress, but when I saw you yesterday, my emotions were so strong. I felt a close connection to you. I don't understand why you don't want to do a DNA test with me. I think you are scared, but whatever makes you scared, just remember that you are stronger than that." The letter, signed as Madeleine, was an extreme form of psychological manipulation. Julia was trying to force a connection, claiming that the McCanns should feel the same emotional bond that she had fabricated in her mind. For Kate and Jerry, this was an additional violation not just of their privacy, but of their memories of Madeleine. Julia was essentially trying to rewrite their grief, pretending to be the child they lost, and demanding they acknowledge her as their daughter. This was a trauma reenactment, a cruel reenactment of the loss, forcing the McCanns to relive their daughter's disappearance through the lens of someone who claimed to be Madeleine. In the courtroom, a recording of Kate's voice was played during the trial. In it, Kate's voice was trembling as she recounted the terror of that evening. It was impossible not to feel the deep, unrelenting distress that Kate was enduring. The recording painted a clear picture of a woman under emotional duress, forced to face a situation she had never imagined in her worst nightmares. The invasion of her personal space by Julia and Karen was an affront to everything the McCanns had gone through. The court was forced to grapple with the fact that, for Julia Wandelt, this was not just an act of delusion, it was a deliberate campaign to inflict harm. The implications of Julia's actions extended far beyond the immediate distress she caused the McCanns. Social media had played a significant role in amplifying Julia's claims, and by the time she physically confronted the McCanns, she had already built a community of online supporters who rallied behind her delusion. This online platform had given Julia the visibility she craved, but it had also placed her in direct conflict with a family that simply wanted to grieve in peace. The public fascination with her story had led her to believe that reality could be rewritten through social media and public attention, and as long as she had a voice, she could push her narrative. The McCann family had already suffered through the public scrutiny and media frenzy that followed Madeleine's disappearance, and now they were forced to endure this new form of harassment. Public victimization had become their reality, as their personal pain was twisted by someone who had no regard for their suffering. In the end, Julia Wandelt's actions were not about finding truth or closure, they were about demanding attention, forcing recognition, and imposing herself into the McCanns' lives in the most invasive way possible. Julia's belief in her own identity as Madeleine McCann was not just a personal delusion, it was an attack on the very fabric of the McCann family's grief and healing process. Julia and Karen's behavior underscores the dangerous intersection of obsession, online fame, and emotional manipulation. In their minds, they were acting in pursuit of truth, but in reality, their actions were a violation of a family that had already been through too much. The physical confrontation at the McCanns' doorstep was the culmination of a cycle of harassment, fueled by the need for visibility and recognition at any cost. In the case of Julia Wandelt and Karen Sprague, the latter played a significant role in fueling the obsessive and disturbing behavior that led to the stalking of the McCann family. Karen Sprague, a 61-year-old woman from Cardiff, was not just a passive bystander. She actively supported Julia's delusion and became entrenched in the conspiracy theories surrounding Madeleine McCann's disappearance. Sprague's belief in these theories and her willingness to go to extreme lengths to support Julia demonstrated a disturbing pattern of co-radicalization, a psychological phenomenon where two individuals, often isolated in their beliefs, find each other online and reinforce each other's distorted worldview. Through this process, both Julia and Karen became more entrenched in their delusions, and their shared obsession with Madeleine McCann became a destructive cycle. Karen Sprague's involvement in the case was more than just providing moral support to Julia. Sprague was a dedicated believer in the conspiracy theories that the McCanns had something to hide regarding Madeleine's disappearance. She openly espoused the belief that the McCann family was somehow complicit in their daughter's disappearance, despite the absence of any credible evidence to support these claims. This conspiracy theory was perpetuated not just through whispered rumors but through open communication between Karen and Julia. One key example of this was a text message exchange between the two women. Karen texted Julia, saying, "We should get their DNA." Julia, emboldened by the support, responded, "Yeah, we could go through their bent." This chilling exchange reflected not just the depth of their fixation on the McCanns, but also their complete disregard for legal and ethical boundaries. To Sprague, the idea of illegally obtaining the McCann family's DNA through their trash was not just a fantasy, it was an actionable plan. The language they used, even the casual "allow" at the end of the message, underscored the normalization of their obsession. What might have once seemed like a fringe idea quickly became something that they believed was necessary to uncover the truth. This marks a key moment in the co-radicalization process, where Julia and Karen's online and real-world interactions reinforced each other's beliefs in a shared, distorted version of reality. Sprague's involvement in Julia's delusion wasn't confined to private messages. She also took action by reaching out to official channels, specifically Operation Grange, the police team investigating Madeleine's disappearance. In an email to the investigation team, Karen wrote, "The truth will come out. Everyone knows the McCanns are guilty." This email was not just an act of online commentary. It was an overt attempt to influence the official investigation and draw attention to her personal beliefs. Karen, much like Julia, was convinced that the McCanns were hiding something so profound that it required constant vigilance and an unrelenting pursuit of the so-called truth. This email demonstrated that Karen wasn't merely supporting Julia in private. She was actively trying to make her voice heard in the public sphere, even attempting to convince law enforcement that the McCanns were involved in a cover-up. The arrogance and self-righteousness in Karen's message revealed a woman who believed she was part of a larger truth-finding mission, one that justified her increasingly extreme actions. The co-radicalization between Julia and Karen can be analyzed through the lens of psychological reinforcement. Both women were isolated in their beliefs prior to meeting each other, Julia with her delusion that she was Madeleine McCann, and Karen with her unwavering belief that the McCanns were guilty. Together, they created a feedback loop in which they reinforced each other's increasingly bizarre and unfounded beliefs. The internet played a central role in this process. Through online platforms, Julia and Karen were able to find each other and validate each other's distorted view of reality. This co-radicalization was evident not only in their private communications, but also in their actions. Karen didn't just sit on the sidelines, she actively aided Julia in her campaign to harass the McCanns. She drove Julia to Rothley, the McCann family's hometown, and together they stalked the McCanns' house in a failed attempt to confront the family in person. This is where the danger of online radicalization becomes clear. The digital world had given Julia and Karen the platform to meet and feed off each other's delusions, which ultimately led to real-world consequences. Karen's role in driving Julia to Rothley is particularly telling. Julia, who had already made numerous online claims about being Madeleine, was emboldened by Karen's support and the shared mission of uncovering the truth. The drive to Rothley was not just about Julia's belief in her own identity. It was about Karen's deep belief in the conspiracy theory that the McCanns were involved in some dark, hidden truth. This belief transcended the online realm and moved into the physical world, with Karen and Julia making the journey to the McCanns' home, an invasion of privacy and an act of aggression designed to force the McCanns into acknowledging Julia's claims. The culmination of Julia and Karen's obsession came on February 19, 2025, when both women were arrested near Bristol Airport. Julia was detained after disembarking from a flight, while Karen was arrested outside, waiting in a car. Karen's role in the arrest was pivotal. She had been a constant presence in Julia's campaign of harassment and delusional pursuit, providing emotional support and logistical assistance every step of the way. The arrest marked the end of their actions, but it also highlighted the severity of their co-radicalization, the way their shared beliefs had driven them to engage in unlawful and dangerous behavior. The public nature of their arrest brought the consequences of their actions into the light, and it was clear that their online delusions had resulted in real-world harm to the McCann family. Karen Sprague's involvement in the harassment of the McCann family was not a passive one. She played an active role in fostering the delusion that had consumed Julia, and her behavior exemplified the psychological dangers of co-radicalization. Through their interactions, Julia and Karen validated each other's false beliefs, becoming increasingly entrenched in a shared fantasy that led to disturbing real-world consequences. The case highlights the power of the internet in amplifying these delusions, allowing two individuals to feed off each other's distorted perceptions of reality. Karen's support of Julia and her actions in driving Julia to Rothley serve as a reminder of how online radicalization can manifest itself in real-world actions, often with devastating effects. The trial of Julia Wandelt and Karen Sprague took center stage on October 6 to 7, 2025, as the legal proceedings brought the disturbing reality of the case to light. Leicester Crown Court became the focal point of intense public interest, with BBC reporters closely tracking the case's progression. As the prosecution began its opening statement, the court was provided with a detailed timeline of events, laying out the disturbing course of Julia's actions over the span of several years. The proceedings would not only examine Julia's stalking of the McCann family, but also the deeper psychological and moral implications of her behavior, especially in the context of the digital age. The trial began with the prosecution's presentation of the evidence that would form the crux of their case. One of the key pieces of evidence was the voicemail recording Julia left for Kate McCann in April 2024. The jury listened to the audio, which depicted Julia pleading with Kate, saying, "Don't give up on your daughter." This emotional and distressing plea was not just a casual message, it was an example of how Julia had crossed the line from obsession to manipulation. The voice was not one of empathy but of coercion, attempting to emotionally force a response from the McCanns by exploiting their grief. The prosecution emphasized how these manipulative actions were not isolated instances. They were part of a broader, disturbing pattern of behavior that had spanned over 2.5 years. Following the playback of the voicemail, the court moved on to the reading of the letters and text messages that Julia had sent to the McCann family. The content of the letters revealed a disturbing level of delusion. One letter, signed with the name Madeleine, was particularly unsettling. In it, Julia expressed her belief that she shared a deep, spiritual connection with the McCanns, using phrases like, "I'm so sorry for causing you so much distress, but when I saw you yesterday, my emotions were so strong." Julia's words were carefully crafted to manipulate the McCanns into accepting her as their daughter, even though she knew, deep down, that these claims were baseless. This psychological manipulation was not only an attempt to force them into acknowledging her, but also a disturbing way to reclaim control over their narrative. In addition to the emotional pleas and confrontations, the prosecution presented digital evidence that Julia had manipulated in her attempts to prove her identity. They detailed how Julia had altered her photos using AI to make herself appear more like Madeleine McCann, Using sophisticated AI tools and deepfake technology, Julia was able to modify her eye patterns and adjust her facial features to resemble Madeleine more closely. This digital fabrication was not just a personal project, it was used as a tool to support her delusional claims. The artificial manipulation of images was pivotal in the prosecution's argument, showing that Julia didn't just imagine herself as Madeleine, she actively constructed a visual reality that others could believe. As part of the evidence, the court also heard about Julia's communications with a Polish charity, where she initially claimed to be other missing children before settling on Madeleine. This further reinforced the notion that Julia's actions were not based on any real connection to Madeleine, but were part of an ongoing obsession with becoming someone else, someone important and visible. As the trial unfolded, several witnesses took the stand to provide crucial insights into the impact Julia's actions had on the McCann family. One of the most significant testimonies came from a psychologist who discussed the emotional toll the harassment had taken on Kate and Jerry McCann. The witness explained that the constant harassment had left the McCanns in a state of chronic stress and sleep deprivation. This emotional and psychological strain was not just a fleeting inconvenience, it was a profound disruption to their daily lives. The witness detailed how the McCanns had been unable to escape the relentless barrage of communication from Julia and how it exacerbated the grief they had already been living with for years. The psychological toll was undeniable. Nightmares, anxiety, and a constant fear of further intrusion were just some of the effects they had to endure. As the case continued, the courtroom delved into the ethical implications of Julia's actions. The central moral question that emerged from the trial was, when does a belief become harmful? Julia may have genuinely believed she was Madeleine McCann, but her actions went far beyond the bounds of personal belief. Her belief system, which was built on distorted perceptions of identity, quickly morphed into psychological harassment that caused real harm to the McCann family. The prosecution made it clear that belief, in and of itself, is not a criminal act. Everyone is entitled to their own thoughts and convictions. However, the moment those beliefs are pushed onto others, especially when they involve manipulation and emotional coercion, they cross into the realm of harassment and psychological violence. The trial highlighted the thin line between holding personal convictions and forcing those convictions onto others in a harmful and intrusive manner. The McCann family did not ask for this interaction. They were simply victims of Julia's compulsive need to prove her false identity. The court grappled with the moral question of whether Julia's belief that she was Madeleine could justify her stalking of the McCanns. Could she have been a victim of her own delusions, or was she merely using her belief as a weapon to manipulate and intrude on the McCanns' lives? The trial ultimately suggested that while Julia's actions may have been driven by mental health issues, the impact on the McCanns could not be ignored. Her persistence and refusal to accept rejection made it clear that this was not a simple case of delusion. It was a deliberate campaign of emotional mistreatment that had a real-life impact on an already traumatized family. The trial of Julia Wandelt and Karen Sprague served as a sobering reminder of the power of belief, delusion, and social media in shaping behavior. While Julia may have genuinely believed she was Madeleine McCann, the way she manifested that belief through altered images, relentless messages, and physical confrontations exposed the dangerous intersection of mental health issues and online radicalization. As the case continues, it will likely raise further questions about how society handles individuals who live in alternate realities created by social media and the psychological and ethical boundaries that exist between personal belief and the harm inflicted on others. The McCanns' suffering continues, not only from the loss of their daughter, but from the unwanted attention of a woman who refused to let go of her delusion, no matter the cost. The case of Julia Wandelt, a young woman who claimed to be Madeleine McCann, raises important psychological questions, particularly regarding the nature of identity formation, mental health disorders, and the role of social media in reinforcing delusions. Julia's story is one that demonstrates how a person can become so immersed in an identity vacuum, where they lose their connection to their true self, and create a new, false identity to fill that void. It also highlights the destructive power of social media in reinforcing distorted beliefs and the ways in which people's perceptions of themselves and the world around them can be shaped by online interactions. To understand Julia's actions, we must first explore her mental health history, the psychological mechanisms at play, and how social media became a vehicle for her self-delusion. Julia Wandelt's case is complex and deeply rooted in mental health issues that had developed over many years. It is reported that Julia had been hospitalized multiple times, suggesting a long-standing struggle with psychological difficulties. The details of her hospitalization are not fully disclosed, but it is clear that Julia's mental health history includes a history of mistreatment. This could have been a significant factor in her later behavior, contributing to feelings of disconnection from her identity and reality. The mental health disorders at play in Julia's case are likely to include dissociative identity disorder, DID, or delusional disorder, both of which could explain her profound disconnection from her true identity. DID often arises as a coping mechanism in response to severe trauma, where an individual dissociates to escape unbearable emotional pain. Julia's claim to be Madeleine McCann could be understood as a false identity formation, a symptom of her mental fragmentation, and an attempt to create an identity that masked her pain and allowed her to escape the trauma of her past. One of the key psychological mechanisms at play in Julia's case is the phenomenon of the identity vacuum. When an individual loses their sense of self or is unable to reconcile their past experiences with their present reality, they can experience an overwhelming feeling of emptiness, a psychological void that needs to be filled. For Julia, this void manifested in her search for a new identity, Madeleine McCann. Julia's attempt to create a new identity can be viewed as a desperate attempt to fill the empty space left by a damaged sense of self. When a person feels disconnected from their authentic identity, whether through trauma, mistreatment, or psychological illness, they may resort to self-invention as a coping mechanism. Julia's adoption of Madeleine McCann's identity was not a random choice. Rather, it was the creation of an identity that offered visibility and recognition. Madeleine McCann, being one of the most famous missing persons in modern history, became the perfect vessel for Julia's need for a new identity, an identity that would finally give her the attention and significance she craved. The role of social media in Julia's story cannot be overstated. Social media platforms served as a mirror, a reflective surface, where Julia could showcase her newly crafted identity and receive the validation she desperately needed. Each comment that echoed phrases like, "You look just like her," or "You have the same eyes as Madeleine," became like a medicine for Julia. The more people validated her delusion, the more entrenched she became in it. Social media provided a platform where her false identity was not only accepted but actively encouraged, feeding her need for attention and validation. This feedback loop is one of the most dangerous aspects of modern internet culture. For Julia, the endless stream of comments reinforcing her false belief allowed her to build an entire world around the notion that she was Madeleine McCann. As Julia received more likes, comments, and shares, her belief in her own identity as the missing girl grew stronger. Social media, with its infinite audience and instant feedback, became the ideal environment for self-deception. Every like and supportive comment acted as a boost to Julia's sense of self-worth, even though the identity she was presenting was not rooted in reality. Julia's story is not unique. Throughout history, there have been many cases of false confessions of identity, where individuals have claimed to be someone they are not. These false claims have ranged from people claiming to be missing children to adults falsely identifying as long-lost relatives. Some of the most famous cases in history involve people who, like Julia, created new identities to gain recognition or to escape their painful realities. For example, the case of Anna Anderson, who spent decades claiming to be Anastasia Romanov, the daughter of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, is a well-known historical example. Anna Anderson's case parallels Julia's in several ways. Both women were driven by a need to create a new identity, and both used manipulation to convince others of their fabricated stories. The psychological mechanisms behind these false identities are complex, but they often stem from a deep sense of loss and desperation. In these cases, the individuals often become trapped in their own delusions, unable to break free from the fiction they've created. The psychological toll of maintaining these false identities can be overwhelming, leading to mental health deterioration and an ever-deepening need for public validation. In Julia's case, Karen Sprague played a crucial role as a reinforcer of Julia's delusion. Sprague was not merely a passive supporter. She became an active participant in Julia's fantasy, helping to validate and amplify her beliefs. Karen's behavior can be understood in the context of co-radicalization, where two individuals with similar delusions or distorted beliefs feed off each other's emotions, reinforcing and escalating the delusion. Karen acted as a substitute mother figure for Julia, further embedding her in the belief that she was the daughter the McCanns lost. By offering Julia constant emotional support and encouraging her actions, Karen became part of the psychological environment that allowed Julia to continue her delusions. Karen's active participation in driving Julia to Rothley, the McCanns' hometown, and her involvement in contacting the McCanns demonstrated how deeply involved she was in perpetuating the delusion. In some ways, Karen functioned as a substitute mother, someone who reinforced Julia's need for family connection and attention. Julia's attachment to Karen was not just emotional, it was deeply psychological. Karen's willingness to support Julia's fantasy gave Julia a sense of belonging and reinforced the idea that her delusion was not just hers alone, it was shared, it was validated, and it was real. Julia Wandelt's story is a tragic example of how mental health struggles can manifest in the digital age. Her identity vacuum, driven by personal trauma and psychological distress, led her to adopt the false identity of Madeleine McCann. Social media, with its endless supply of validation, played a central role in reinforcing her delusion, and Karen Sprague acted as a crucial enabler of Julia's fantasy, offering constant validation and emotional support. Julia's story raises important questions about the psychological consequences of living in an era where identity can be constructed online, and where validation often comes at the expense of truth. It serves as a warning about the dangers of social media and the way it can exacerbate mental health issues, especially for individuals already struggling with identity crisis. Ultimately, Julia's delusion highlights the fragility of the human psyche and the devastating impact of online echo chambers that feed distorted beliefs. In the case of Julia Wandelt, a young woman who claimed to be the missing child Madeleine McCann, the legal, media, and moral dimensions of the case present complex questions about responsibility, truth, and the power of public platforms. Wandelt's actions raise concerns about the intersection of mental health, media influence, and online communities, all of which played a pivotal role in the development of her false identity. To analyze this situation fully, we can break it down into three main layers: the media firewall, the legal firewall, and the moral firewall. The media firewall refers to the way different media outlets filter and present stories to the public, often influencing how these stories are perceived by audiences. In the UK, the media's approach to the Julia Wandelt case was significantly more restrained than in other countries, particularly the United States, where public opinion and media coverage are often more sensationalized. The trial in Leicester Crown Court was not broadcast live, and there was a deliberate effort to keep the proceedings from becoming a spectacle for public consumption. This media restraint was an effort to protect the privacy of the McCann family and to ensure that the legal process remained the focus, rather than the infamy of the case itself. In contrast, platforms like YouTube and other online outlets have become places where stories are exploited for views and likes. Julia Wandelt, for instance, was idolized by certain segments of the internet community. YouTubers and social media influencers played a significant role in amplifying her claims, despite the fact that there was no solid evidence supporting her identity as Madeleine McCann. These platforms, unlike traditional news outlets, embrace sensationalism as a way to drive engagement. As a result, Julia was elevated to a kind of hero status among certain followers, many of whom saw her as the underdog fighting for the truth. This divergence between the media's approach in the UK and the exploitative nature of social media platforms highlights the power that media outlets have in shaping public narratives. In the UK, traditional media held back from glorifying or sensationalizing Julia's claims, recognizing the danger of turning the case into a circus. On the other hand, the internet, with its unregulated nature, allowed Julia's story to be broadcast and shared without the same ethical oversight. The legal firewall is the boundary set by the law between personal belief and harmful actions. Julia's belief that she was Madeleine McCann could be understood as a mental health issue. However, the legal system is tasked with drawing a clear distinction between personal beliefs and the harmful consequences that arise when those beliefs infringe on the rights and privacy of others. Julia's actions harassing the McCann family through emails, phone calls, and personal visits, as well as altering images to make herself appear as Madeleine, crossed the line from belief into criminal behavior. The legal system recognized this when it upheld the McCann family's right to privacy, ruling that Julia's actions went beyond mere free expression. Her belief, while possibly stemming from a psychological disorder, could not justify the stalking and harassment she inflicted on a grieving family. The court's decision to allow DNA testing further cemented the breakdown of Julia's delusion. Once the DNA tests proved that she was not Madeleine McCann, the false identity she had built was definitively destroyed. By recognizing the legal boundaries between personal delusion and infringement on others' rights, the law established that freedom of belief cannot be used as a defense when it causes harm to others. This is crucial in understanding the role of law in managing the complexities of mental health, public behavior, and privacy rights. The moral firewall addresses the ethical responsibility of the internet and media platforms in nurturing collective delusions. In Julia's case, the internet provided a platform for her delusion to gain traction. Social media, with its emphasis on likes, shares, and validation, allowed Julia's false identity to be validated by hundreds of thousands of followers, some of whom encouraged her behavior. The real question is, who is responsible for the harm caused by collective delusions that grow in online spaces? Should the internet be held accountable for the platforming of delusional content that leads to real-world consequences? Julia's delusion might have been exacerbated by the feedback loop created by internet communities that amplified her claims. Online communities were quick to support Julia, reinforcing her belief that she was Madeleine McCann. As a result, Julia's delusion was not an isolated phenomenon, but rather one that was nurtured and amplified by the very platform designed to connect people. This raises critical moral questions about the role of social media in shaping people's behavior and beliefs. When individuals begin to see their delusions validated and celebrated online, it becomes difficult to distinguish between reality and fantasy. In this case, the internet did not serve as a tool for truth, but rather as a weapon that enabled delusion. The individuals who supported Julia's false claims, and the platforms that allowed them to spread, share, and amplify those claims, share some moral responsibility for the harm caused to the McCann family. The question becomes, who is responsible when online platforms foster a false narrative that leads to real-world harm? Julia Wandelt believed that she was on a quest for truth, but in doing so, she lost herself. The line between searching for answers and harassing a grieving family is thin, and social media, the law, and moral responsibility all play a part in defining where that line should be drawn. Julia's delusion was fed by social media, broken down by the law, and enabled by moral indifference. The tragedy of Julia's situation lies in the fact that, in her pursuit of truth, she became so entrenched in her own belief that she lost sight of the damage she was causing to the McCanns. Julia believes she is seeking the truth, but in her journey toward Madeleine, she has lost herself. This statement encapsulates the heart of Julia's delusion. She believed that uncovering the truth about her identity would lead her to validation and closure, but in reality, she lost herself in the process. The truth she sought was not the reality of her identity, but the destructive lie that had been perpetuated by her own mind and amplified by the internet. If a person builds a firewall to protect a lie, who is the one who starts the fire? This powerful question highlights the deeper issue at play: When we choose to hide behind delusions, whether individually or collectively, we risk starting a fire that can have devastating consequences. It is not just the individuals who create the lie that must take responsibility, but also the platforms and audiences that enable the lie to grow. The consequences of internet-driven delusions are clear. They not only distort reality for the individuals involved, but also inflict harm on the people they target. As a society, we must ask ourselves how much responsibility we bear for the consequences of the stories we choose to amplify.